Hello everyone, today we're going to be looking at a short convention scenario from Call of Cthulhu's Gateways to Terror. The scenario in question is Dead Border. It is the third scenario in the collection, and as you can see here, it's been nicely laid out and it has nice artwork as well as sample postcards, historical photographs, maps, and nicely made handouts. As with the scenario What's in the Cellar, Dead Border can also be downloaded for free from the Chaosium website. The scenario is almost exactly the same. The production quality of the maps, handouts, and just general layout of the scenario is lower. So if you really like having your high quality maps and handouts, could be worth picking up Gateways to Terror. If that doesn't bother you so much, then the free version of this scenario will suffice. As the Gateways to Terror version is the superior form of the scenario, just in terms of production quality, that is the scenario I will be reviewing. So, Dead Border is a scenario set in 1931 in Providence, Rhode Island during the Great Depression. The Great Depression, I think, is a very cool, different setting, as is Providence, Rhode Island. The majority of published material for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, especially the non-pulp scenarios, are set in the 1920s rather than the 1930s. And a lot of that material is set in Lovecraft country in New England rather than kind of Rhode Island here, which is a change of pace. I think the scenario is fun in that it's different for those reasons, but keep in mind it may be difficult to fit this into a campaign, especially if you're using this scenario to, say, introduce the investigators to each other. You may have a hard time finding other published material both in the Rhode Island area and also in the Great Depression era. So that's something to keep in mind. The scenario suggests to you that you can integrate this into a campaign by having the players kind of staying in the boarding house in which the scenario was based and kind of doing other investigations while progressively realizing that the victim of the scenario is behaving in a strange way. I think that is a good suggestion. Just again, bear in mind that it may be difficult to integrate this one into published material, other scenarios that Chaosium or third parties have published for Call of Cthulhu, just based on the setting and the era that this takes place in. That said, if you can find some material for the 1930s, I think this represents a good starting point. All right, from here on out, I will be discussing spoilers, so if this is a scenario you plan to play in the future and have not played yet, stop the video here, send the video to your keeper. I'm going to review the scenario if it's a good scenario for your group, and I'll try to give some advice to improve the gameplay experience. So, keepers, hope you stay with me here, and I'm going to run through the scenario. So in addition to the things I already mentioned about the setting of the scenario and how you could integrate this into an existing campaign, a lot of the clues in this scenario are either linked to the Dreamlands, discuss the connection of events and characters in the scenario to the Dreamlands, and include general information about the Dreamlands. For that reason, I think this would be an excellent starting point to a Dreamlands campaign, especially if you're willing to set that in the 1930s. Since you're going to the Dreamlands, I don't think that matters too much, but just bear in mind that this is set in the 1930s in Providence, so make those decisions about whether it's suitable as an entry point to your campaign accordingly. This scenario is really good. It's kind of a locked room whodunit. Your players will, as the scenario is written, start in media res, going to investigate the room of their missing neighbor in the boarding house who no one has seen for a couple days. They're the pre-generated characters that come with the scenario all have motivations for going into the room, be it because they have good relationships with the character, because the character owes them things that either haven't been returned or haven't been delivered, because the character has compromising information on them potentially that they need to recover, or just because their character background is that they're a nosy person. That last one is a little bit weaker, but I think they're all strong motivations for the pre-generated characters to get into the room and get events going if you want to kick it off as the scenario was written in media res. Once your characters are able to open that door up, they're going to see that James Gardner, the character in question, whose room it is dead. He's dead on a tarpaulin, there's a lot of blood everywhere, and there's weird scars all over his body. So immediately your players are going to have a fun whodunit through investigation and skill use throughout the room. They should be able to piece together that this was a ritualistic suicide. But why did he kill himself in this manner then becomes the next question. So there's still going to be a motivation to continue to look around that room for clues that they've missed. Eventually, they're going to find out that he killed himself to prepare his body as a vessel for a entity from another realm to take possession of it. He did this unintentionally. He was tricked. But you're then going to get a climatic fight scene with a entity possessing James Gardner's body and trying to steal the book that has the necessary spells and information about the dreamlands that your players will hopefully have found from your players, and then make its escape. In the process, it may kill them, but really it just wants to get that book and get out of there. So a total party kill is by no means a guarantee here. All right. The scenario, as written, encourages the players to involve the police immediately. It does that through the young NPC, Tommy, who volunteers to go get the police when it's discovered that there's a dead body in this room. Generally, encouraging your players to involve the police in Call of Cthulhu is a bad idea, and not really in keeping with the spirit of the game. So it's not something you want to be getting your players used to. However, in this scenario, it works well for a number of reasons. The first reason is that when it's suggested the police are summoned, there's nothing really supernatural going on in the room. Yes, there appears to be a murder. Yes, there is some strange aspects to it, but there is nothing overtly unnatural going on at that point. So it does logically make sense that the police would be contacted, because looking into murders is their job. In terms of the scenario itself, though, involving the police is actually a good idea for a couple of reasons. As the scenario mentions, if your players are really struggling with the climax, having the police show up at an opportune moment with some additional firepower is just going to help bring forth a positive resolution to the scenario. And given it's a convention scenario, your goal is likely in this 1 hour of time to give your players an enjoyable experience. If the thing just kills them all and runs away, that might be in keeping with the themes of Call of Cthulhu, but it might not be in keeping with everyone having a fun time in their 1 hour of play. So the police are involved for that reason. The Gardner possessed thing, or conversely, the thing that is possessing Gardner, may also kill a few of the pre-generated characters. So having the police show up, there are profiles for those NPCs, and you can just hand them out to your players, get them involved right back into the scenario, and you're not going to have people sitting at the table with nothing to do for the really most exciting part of the scenario. So for those reasons, I would encourage you to use the scenario as written, make sure the police are summoned, and either things are going to go well for your players and the police are just going to show up after it's all over, or things are not going to go well and you have ready-made replacement characters, and if no one's died, then you have some NPCs to help the player characters out if they're struggling. On the topic of the police, it wouldn't be a Chaosium scenario if there weren't a few typos and just poorly edited and proofread things in it. and this is no exception. There's on page 65, there's a page reference to where you can find those NPC profiles for the police. Very handy, or it would be if there was actually a page reference that followed, but you just have a couple @ signs instead of a page number. So obviously that was meant to be put in the editing process, and it wasn't done, and the proofreader didn't catch it. And that's unfortunately a common theme with Chaosium products. That said, it should not detract from your ability to easily run this, and the production quality, apart from that, is very good. In terms of the clues in this scenario, I think they're quite well done. It's a scenario where your players will really only be investigating one room, so it should be pretty easy for you to manage. That said, there are a number of clues in there. There's diverse clues in there. There's clues or objects in that room that relate to individual pre-generated characters and their motivations for being in that room, in particular the business associate and the bookstore owner. Both have things that they want to find in there that can be found. But more generally, there's a good amount of clues that will allow your players to discover about the Dreamlands, about Gardner, about what was troubling Gardner prior to his death, about the pact he made with an entity in the Dreamlands that he believed would allow him to return to his dreaming state in the Dreamlands, perhaps on a permanent basis, but which the entity was actually just tricking him and preparing his body for possession. You'll also be able to find the spell that Gardner cast to kind of prepare armor on his body, which will become relevant in the climax, and is a piece of information your players will need to competently combat this entity in the climax. Specifically, they will have to, having read the book, know that he's prepared ritualistic armor on his body, but that his head is a vulnerable target, and on the basis of their empirical experience of perhaps shooting at the body and no harm really being done, and the basis of the information they found in clues before the kind of entity takes possession of Gardner's body, the clues are all there for them to be able to effectively engage with this entity, but it's not something that can just be easily engaged by blasting at its body with guns. So that is nice in the Call of Cthulhu kind of sense of without proper preparation and interpretation of the clues in your possession, you may not be able to achieve a positive resolution to the scenario. As I previously discussed, there is also a really strong connection to the Dreamlands. Your players have the ability to find a tome about the Dreamlands, and in that regard, this can serve as a good introduction to a campaign that in future scenarios may be based in the Dreamlands. So I like the clues that are included in that regard as well. There's really only 2 NPCs in the scenario as written. One is Mrs. Madeira. She lives across the hall from Gardner. She doesn't really have any all that pertinent information for the player characters if they investigate what she's aware of. She's just going to reiterate information they should already have or should have already deduced based on what they found in Gardner's room. I suppose it is good to include her, though, just in terms of if your players are not engaging with those clues or if somehow they're not finding relevant information, she can give them the bare bones of what maybe went on and kind of make them realize we better get back to the room and look around further because there's something a little weird going on here. As written, however, she's not a particularly compelling NPC. She's not a PC any of your players are really going to remember long after the game. And I think that's true of Tommy as well. Tommy is a little bit more compelling, I think, as a character, kind of, an eager child who wants to help out. But really, he's just written into the scenario to have an NPC available to get the police, and he's going to vanish about 1 to 2 minutes into the scenario, only to come back at the end and probably not really be a major factor. In that regard, not a particularly complex scenario that may be appealing to newer keepers, but for players who like kind of more complexity in the scenario, you're not going to find it here. There's really only one location. there's really only 2 NPCs, and neither of them, you don't get much out of engaging with either of them. The climax of the scenario, I think, is good. As I've said, if your players are not using the clues they should have collected from the room, as well as the empirical evidence that certain approaches are not working, they're not going to get a positive resolution to the scenario. But if they do, they have a good shot. Again, it's nice that the scenario involves summoning the police, because even if they don't deduce this, the police can potentially show up, save the day, and ensure everyone at the table remains involved by, getting handed a new character if need be. I don't have particularly a great deal of advice in terms of what you should do running this scenario. I think it's a pretty straightforward scenario. I think as written, it includes a good amount of support for you in terms of what to do at various moments. My only real advice relates to the end of the scenario, and I think as written, the rewards section and the epilogue section are very poor. The rewards section, I think, is terrible. I think it's far too generous, and it suggests you give every player involved in the game 1d6 worth of sanity if their character survived. It doesn't matter what happened, they just get 1d6 worth of sanity for surviving. This isn't really in keeping with other Call of Cthulhu scenarios where the amount of sanity you gain or lose is dependent on the outcome of the scenario and the actions you took within it. And I think that's a far more satisfying way and a far more logical way to handle things. I think you're going to be rewarding your players for taking appropriate actions to get positive outcomes, and you're going to be punishing them if they didn't with that approach. And in that way, you're going to be showing them that their actions actually mattered and also affected their character in terms of the outcome of the scenario that their actions produced had an effect on their character, and an effect that was logical. By just giving everyone 1d6 san, you negate all of that. So what I would do is I would tailor that differently. I would reward them more for keeping hold of the book. I would reward them more for dealing with the gardener thing. And I would actually punish them if one potential resolution to the scenario is they realize the thing wants the book, they hand it over to the thing, and just step aside as it walks out of the room. Very anticlimactic, but that's a possible outcome. As written, they would get exactly the same sanity for doing that and giving this evil entity that has clearly tricked someone into committing ritual suicide, is a monstrous looking thing, and is now in possession of a book that has a number of spells, particularly dangerous potentially to the surrounding community, to just waltz away, and they don't really care. Logically, that would probably be troubling to a player character, knowing they'd allowed this villainous entity really to walk away in possession of a potentially dangerous tome, and that they kind of just abrogated their responsibility in that situation. But the scenario would just have you give them 1d6, the exact same amount they would have gotten if they actively took charge and potentially chased this thing down and recovered the tome and ensured it was dealt with and not a threat to the community. So I would strongly suggest ensuring that actions have consequences in terms of the sanity rewards. I'm really not sure why, as written, the scenario didn't do that. I think that's a major, major flaw with the scenario, and something that you should address as a keeper. This is a little bit more personal preference, but I really don't like the way the epilogue is written. Don't get me wrong, I think in a one-shot game, a convention game where those characters aren't going to get used again, and that's certainly going to be the case if you're playing the game at a convention with strangers, but even if you sit down with your friends, you say, let's just play this as a one-shot, there's not going to be a continuing campaign. I think it is great to include an epilogue for your players and kind of go into a little bit of detail about, how the players might be affected, the player characters might be affected afterwards, kind of what happens to the ones that survive, and to kind of engage with your players and kind of collaboratively create that narrative. Perhaps you kind of integrate some little seeds of further horror elements in, perhaps you don't. judge your table, judge what your players are kind of looking to get out of it. But this particular epilogue doesn't really do that. It just repeats, in what I think is a patronizing way, information that your players should have discovered in the scenario, information that they would have had in the scenario if they found the appropriate clues, and presents it as if it's, revelatory information that there's no way they could have known this as the scenario was unfolding. But they did know it, probably, and they were probably intelligent enough as players to figure out what it all meant. And the epilogue just acts as if they're not, and explains everything in a really simple way. Now, you can certainly use the epilogue if your players didn't find appropriate clues or didn't make connections of things together. But if they did, then this epilogue is not only useless, but it's actually a little bit patronizing to their intelligence. So I would craft a more personalized epilogue. I would not use at all the epilogue as written if your players actually successfully engaged with the scenario, figured out what was going on. There's no need to repeat that information to them after they've already figured it out themselves. And I would do my best to create an epilogue that kind of relates to their characters, actions they took in the scenario, how that might have affected them moving forward, and kind of what becomes of them if they are troubled, check themselves into asylums, interesting little things like this. Obviously, if you're using this as the start to a campaign, then you don't need to do an epilogue. You can just do an investigator development phase and head into the next scenario. But if this is a one-shot, I would recommend tweaking the epilogue as written. Well, there you have it. That's really all I have to say about Dead Border. I think it's a pretty good scenario. It's going to give people 1 hour worth of entertainment. There's a whodunit component. There's a climatic battle with a possessed corpse component, and you're probably going to get a positive resolution because, as written, the police are going to show up and help the players, even if they're not doing too hot on their own. So I think people should have fun with this one. I would definitely recommend changing the rewards, recommend improving on the epilogue. But if you're looking for a one-shot, if you're looking for the start to some kind of campaign in the Dreamlands or in the 1930s, I think this is well worth a look. If you're looking to get it for free, you can. It's on the Chaosium website. I'll include a link in the description below, as well as a link to the Gateways to Terror. So yeah, I recommend you check this one out if you're running a game of Call of Cthulhu, or even if you're interested in running a game of Call of Cthulhu, because it is for free. And I do discuss in another video about how you can play Call of Cthulhu for free for 2 months. In the first video I did about Call of Cthulhu, I'll include a link to that below so you can take a look at that as well. I hope this was useful. If you have run Dead Border, if you've played Dead Border, if you have other thoughts to share, don't hesitate to contribute them to the comments section. And then if you have questions that there's some aspect of the scenario you're not sure I've addressed, please feel free to ask that as well. Perhaps others can address that in the comments section, or I can certainly get to that as well and let you know my thoughts. Well, there you have it. There's another scenario from Gateways to Terror, book for Call of Cthulhu by Chaosium. And until next time, happy gaming.